Good morning. Morning to our mega desk. Things look a bit different in here this week because this is the huge setup that we're getting ready for the local election programmes and all the politicking around that in a couple of weeks' time. And you're joining us on BBC Two because of all of those impressive souls who are getting pounding on London's pavements on the marathon over on BBC One. But thrilled you're with us here on Two. Let's start with a look at the front pages of the newspapers. There they are. The Observer claims the Tories have a plan to politicise the civil service after the RAB scandal. The Sunday Times has a fascinating story about an MI6 spy. The Sunday Telegraph says the Home Secretary is ready to defy judges on migrants. The tabloids, the Scottish Sunday Mail, the SNP cops hunting for burner phones. We'll talk about that with the editor of that paper who's with us. And the Mirror with some details of Boris Johnson having another lavish £4,000 a night holiday, they claim. But let's start with our conversation about what's going on in our schools. Welcome to all three of you. Thanks for being with us this morning. Mary, firstly to you, is the way that schools are inspected working at the moment?
No, it's not working at all. The problem is the crisis has now come to a fore, but it's been a problem which has been growing over decades. And the problem is that Ofsted doesn't inspect schools fairly, and that Ofsted doesn't know whether it raises qualities in schools at all. It has no research to back up the claims it makes about, getting schools to be better at teaching and learning. And the problem that teachers and leaders have is that they've got no idea which inspection team will turn up at their school, one which will do a decent inspection or one which will be aggressive and demeaning.
So you think there's variability in the system, but this conversation has really come about because of the very sad death of Ruth Perry, a head teacher who took her own life. There's an interesting history to something quite similar that happened in Scotland, where schools are run differently, they're inspected differently, but just tell us about what happened.
About 15 years ago, a teacher died in the Borders, and certainly it was decided that there was inquiry, and it was felt that she had taken her own life as a result of an inspection. And there was a cultural shift, and it meant that the traditional inspections didn't actually happen, and it's far more over a course of days. It's over, has a number of factors involved, and certainly I don't think in Scotland we see the same problems that teachers are talking about. So
there was a culture change, but some people might say, Henry, that basically everybody blames the ref, right? Teachers, like lots of us, don't necessarily like being judged. As a parent, what do you think of Ofsted? Is it useful?
So I've been a parent. I've also been a governor in a state school in Hackney, my children's state school. Clearly, you need someone. It is useful to have someone holding you to account, and I think that the conversations at the Ofsted inspection that we had as governors were very useful to us to help ask the teachers. What I worry about, however, is when you get your excellent, this huge gap between inspections. So I do think it should be a little bit more supportive, little and often, rather than a kind of a judgment.
Make or break
it's the process enables you to ask the right questions.
OK, well, lots to get into with the Chief Inspector, so we're going to talk a lot about education this morning. Thank you, all three of you, for now. Let's go to the classroom then. In January, the head teacher, Ruth Perry, took her own life while she was waiting for an Ofsted report to be published. She knew it would downgrade the school she loved from outstanding to inadequate, the lowest measure. But her death has supercharged a conversation that was already rumbling about how England schools are inspected and graded, and it's led to many teachers expressing concerns about the pressure. Now, this week, Ofsted said it was going to make some changes in particular elements of their inspections after Ruth's death, but her family has clearly laid the blame for what happened at Ofsted's door, and they're calling for a halt to all inspections.
There is no doubt in my family's mind at all that Ruth killed herself because of that Ofsted inspection. She was fine beforehand. She was not fine during and after it. So it is a potentially dangerous system.
Now, to be clear, no one can know exactly what was going on in Ruth Perry's mind, but you hear how clear her family's conviction were about what was happening. Welcome to you, Amanda Spielman. You're the Chief Inspector for England's schools, and it's the first time that you've spoken since that terrible event. What is your response to the family's very clear view that the downgrade of the school played a part in her death?
Well, first of all, Ruth Perry's death was clearly a tragic event. It's something that I and my colleagues at Ofsted feel very deeply. And of course, we have the most profound sympathy for her family and for all the Caversham school community. Of course, there'll be a coroner's inquest, I hope in the not too distant future, and we will be fully cooperating with that, sharing everything that we have from the inspection.
But do you think that the inspection came to the right conclusion?
I do. I think the findings were secure, and I think the inspection team worked with the professionalism and sensitivity that I would expect from our inspectors.
Have you any concerns at all about what happened during that inspection when her school went from outstanding to inadequate?
From what I've seen, I don't have any reason to doubt the inspection. Inspection is a sensitive process. We are there looking for children, looking for whether education is right for children, looking at whether protecting children's welfare is happening the way it should. Sometimes that can mean we have very difficult, very sensitive conversations in an inspection. Our inspectors are trained, prepared, they've all worked in schools themselves. They really understand what it feels like at the receiving end.
We've taken a look at the report into Caversham, as you would expect, and we can show the summary to our viewers this morning. Now, it was marked good on the quality of education, good on behaviour, good on personal development, inadequate on leadership, good on early years provision. And if you look further into the report, there's some quotes there. Pupils enjoy coming to this welcoming and vibrant school. Relationships between staff are warm and supportive. And when you look at that and you read the report in full and you listen to the outpouring of concern there's been in that community and terrible sadness, can't you help but conclude that to judge a school with one blunt word, inadequate, is to blunt a system?
So first of all, it's really important for people to understand that we do look at safeguarding as well as all the aspects of quality of education. We look at behaviour, we look at personal development, we look at leadership and management. But there are times when failures in safeguarding can be sufficiently serious that alone can bring an overall judgment down. We actually make a number of judgments in an inspection. We make 4 key judgments plus a judgment of the effectiveness of safeguarding. Yes, they are synthesised into an overall judgment. That's partly to help parents. We know that parents like the clarity and simplicity of the model. It's also because the wider system of school accountability that government operates does use those overall judgments. So it's not for us to say, we're going to fundamentally change the grading system. That would have to be a bigger government decision.
But there has been a huge conversation in the last couple of weeks about boiling all the complexities, all of the knowledge in a school, all of the environment and the atmosphere down to a school, down just to a one-word label. And you say there that parents want it, but we have been inundated with emails from our viewers about this subject. Suzanne, who's a parent, says, I'd like to know why Ofsted are continuing with this scoring system. Labelling a school good or bad doesn't give me a choice. The submitted report is clear and fair. Now, are you telling parents watching this morning that you don't trust them to read 4 pages of a report, that they can only deal with one word?
Of course we trust them, and of course we test our reports. We've done a lot of work with parents, and we survey to find out whether they're finding our reports useful. That's a core part of our work. It's one of the audiences that inspection serve. It's the prime audience, actually. Parents want the assurance that comes from the inspection process and the knowledge that schools are going through the inspection process, as well as the reports themselves.
But when it comes to the impact that single word can have, it clearly is causing huge concern. We had another email from a teacher who said, I've taught in a secondary school for 43 years. To label a school with a single word based on 2 days is far too simplistic. And this teacher asks, I would like to know how many years teaching experience you have that gives you confidence to say this is the best way of doing things.
Every inspector has many years of experience. Every inspector has been a school leader. Every inspector understands what it's like at the receiving end. So it is really important to understand that. This is not a group of people from a completely different context coming in and having these conversations and making these judgments. It is people who are themselves deeply steeped in the world of schools. Many of them are current serving heads or deputy heads. Our inspection model draws on the inspector. So it's really important for people to understand inspectors aren't beings from another planet. They are absolutely human beings understanding those sensitivities and difficult issues.
But do you think then that nothing's going wrong?
I think inspection has a tough job to do. There are many people who are sort of profoundly opposed to the wider system of accountability, who would like something very different. It's essentially a political debate about the right way to run the school system
But
overall.
you must have a view as the Chief Inspector of Schools, and on that particular issue of the one word, you said that it was Minister's decision as to whether or not they would stick with that system. But with your experience of running the organisation, and I know you're standing down towards the end of this year, so with your experience, actually, would it be better to say, let's just get rid of that label, give parents the 4-page report, do the job essentially in exactly the same way, but just get rid of that one word which can cause such distress and upset. And you know what happens when a school's rated inadequate. Sometimes people lose their jobs. Sometimes teachers leave.
There are two different questions actually rolled up in that. One is about the judgments themselves and one is about the wording. My own view is this, that if we changed simply the wording of the judgments and that the same judgments were there but with a different label on them, in 3 or 6 or 9 months' time, people would be saying it's not about the precise wording, it's about what they signify. So I think it is really important to concentrate on what they signify. But every judgment in the system has a use at the moment. They are used for, not just for parents but also for government, both in allocating support and in deciding where interventions are necessary. So it would have to be a bigger, wider reform of the education system to do that. We have designed the inspection model and the set of judgments to fit the education system as it's currently conceived. It would be possible to run the whole school system differently, and you might design inspection differently for that. But for the system as it stands today, we've designed a solid model.
Do you think it is an effective model, though? I mean, academics have looked at 10 years of Ofsted inspections, and once they'd taken into account children's backgrounds, they basically found no detectable difference. That was the academics' phrase, no detectable difference between good, requires improvement, and inadequate. So what evidence do you have that it's actually working?
We've got 30 years of Ofsted in action. We've been doing our job thoroughly and carefully, and that it may be contributing to there being relatively little between school variation in this country compared to some others. We recently restarted inspecting the schools that had been judged outstanding many years ago, and an exemption was put in place for schools with an outstanding judgment back in 2010. So some of those schools went 10, 15, almost 15 years without inspection.
And was that a mistake?
I do believe it was a mistake, and the profile of judgments we're seeing coming out of those re-inspections shows that many of those schools are no longer coming out as outstanding.
That indeed is what we believe happened at Caversham Primary, Ruth Perry's school. But just before we move on to some wider issues, her family say that you haven't been in contact with them and they've found that difficult. Are you going to speak to Ruth Perry's family?
Of course, we'd be more than happy to speak to them if they would like to. We haven't wanted to intrude on their grief. We haven't had any approach, but we haven't ignored anything and would happily speak to them.
And will you then? I mean, why haven't you reached out so far?
Well, it's a delicate balance when you have a grieving family, whether to intrude on that or not. But as I say, we're absolutely open to doing that.
Okay, because they've said publicly they haven't heard from you, and actually we've also spoken to her sister here at the BBC, and she's expressed a desire to have contact from you. Why do you think, though, more broadly, there is a culture of fear around Ofsted? I mean, maybe there are myths. Maybe it's not justified, but do you acknowledge that that culture does exist?
I certainly acknowledge that it exists. I think it comes from a couple of things, perhaps. One is the consequences that people think about in the context of inspection, especially for inadequate judgments, which I should say are a tiny proportion. Nearly 9 out of 10 schools going through inspection, the judgment is good or outstanding. For the vast majority of schools, I know that it's a positive and affirming experience.
Really?
Absolutely, we get plenty of feedback to say that inspection is a constructive professional dialogue. That's how it is designed to be a constructive professional dialogue that really helps people think about what they're doing, really helps them take things forward. That's the essence of how we design it,
Okay.
and how we train people.
Okay, well, I want to talk about some wider issues,
Yeah.
because Ofsted, of course, is a big survey of what's going on in our schools all over the place. Is it harder, do you think, to be a pupil in this country since the pandemic?
I think it's a really tough time for schools at the moment, for teachers, heads and pupils. The post-COVID hangover, if I can put it like that, is quite acute. We've got all the different post-COVID problems. During COVID, schools did do a fantastic job. Coming back, they've got pupils not just with sort of academic catch-up needs, but also with greater mental health difficulties, with more special educational needs. Behaviour is challenging, socialisation's delayed. So it's a really hard time to manage a school, especially when the external services that you need more of sometimes aren't even fully back on stream. So it's a tough time out there.
It's been very, very striking, in fact, in the last couple of days. We've heard from lots of teachers, we've heard from lots of parents. Do you think that this is a sector that is in a bad shape? I mean, do you worry about what's going on? Have you seen it like this before?
I think there's a lot of unhappiness. Obviously, there are disputes with government about pay and funding. There's clearly a lot of bad feeling around. And when there is bad feeling around, Ofsted often becomes a sort of lightning rod through which the tensions and frustrations can be discharged.
Do you think you're being unfairly blamed?
I think it's really important to understand that there's a wider disagreement here between different factions about how schools should be run, how school accountability should work more broadly. We're just one part of that system. We're not the regulator. We don't make decisions about what happens to school. We are just the inspectorate going to look and see whether children are getting the experience they should in schools.
But it's interesting because we've heard and read a lot of anxiety and also a lot of anger towards how Ofsted inspectors sometimes behave, a lot of anger with how the organisation operates. And I don't think anybody would doubt your good intentions, but listening to you this morning, I think some of our viewers watching might wonder if you really understand the depth of feeling, if you really get the strength of feeling towards Ofsted.
I absolutely do, but I also look very hard at what we actually hear back from inspections on the ground. So I think it's really difficult when you've got both the reality on the ground and also perceptions that can sometimes get exacerbated by external narratives.
What do you mean by that?
If people hear about inspection but haven't actually experienced it, especially not experienced it in recent years, they may come to believe things that aren't actually true. So inspection, so firstly, we had a big COVID suspension, so only there's quite a small proportion of schools that have been inspected since the pandemic began. That's quite a long while in many people's working lives. And also inspection only touches a small proportion of the people in the school, typically the most senior people. So you may make something that's a really constructive conversation, but there simply isn't the capacity in the system to go out and talk to meet every teacher, talk to every teacher. I wish there were, but we have to work within the constraints that are set.
One of the things that many people are concerned about that's happened also since the pandemic is the rate of absences.
Yes.
Now, we know there's a significant increase. Some latest figures suggest there are 140,000 children, I believe in England alone, who were regularly, severely absent. Where are all these kids who are missing so much school?
Well, firstly, it's clear that some children have fallen out of the system entirely, and it's really hard to know what's going on. Our responsibilities are to inspect schools and colleges and apprenticeships, so it's hard for us to know where they are, but we have expressed significant concern. But there's also, within that, far more children who are attending some but not enough school. The children who 3 years ago were there sort of 9 days out of 10, and now they're 8 days out of 10.
This is a really significant problem.
It is
isn't
significant,
it?
which is why we've been
lost children. They've slipped through the net.
Well, some of them are lost. More of them. There's a really big group of children who are not attending school enough to really get the most out of it, to get the benefit of education. You do need to be there day after day, week after week, month after month. It's a long-term business, education. So doing everything everything that we can to make sure that children are in school regularly, to help schools maintain those relationships with families that help to get children there. We published a report last year summarising all the things that we can see are helpful, but we know that this is a big sector challenge.
Just finally and briefly, if you can, there have been already some teaching strikes. There are going to be more. We'll talk about it a bit later this morning. But are you concerned about the damage that could do to children?
Well, of course. Children have missed a great deal over the last few years. It is so important that their education continues and is interrupted as little as it can possibly be.
So would you urge the unions not to walk out, or the governments to pay the teachers more?
I hope that disputes can be resolved rapidly and constructively, because we know that children need to be at school.
OK, Amanda Spielman, thank you so much for giving us your time this morning. Chief Inspector of Schools in England, thank you very much indeed for taking all of our questions. Now,